So now for a little more pro-hydrogen propaganda. This was actually my own, yes. Name it as it is. Counter-propaganda, the truth. So this was my own study. It was looking at how we can contribute to energy security in the UK. And so essentially the same is true for Europe. In the UK, energy security is quite an important topic. They have what they call the energy dilemma, which is increasing efficiency, reducing emissions, and at the same time being cost competitive. So something, if you stay within the conventional thinking, doesn't really fit together. So that's something you can continuously work on, and we're trying to shift them towards slightly different thinking of costs, which will then make them put them in a position to actually reconcile these 3 points. So if you map energy security, if you look in the internet how energy security is defined, you'll find several sets of definitions, and we sort of settled for this one. So essentially on the left side you have things, on the right side, what we called robustness, so long-term security, which is access to energy, it's access to availability of energy, and on the left side it's resilience. So it's so on the right side it's like continuous, on the left side it's incident. So if anything happens to the infrastructure, what happens? So that's what we call resilience. That's about any sort of natural disasters, or say a terrorist attack or sabotage or whatever, or just failure, technical failure. So that's the 2 sides of, say, the technical security, and then you have the cost to the consumer on top, so the energy price, which is quite a topic in the UK because we have this consistent topic of energy poverty. So you have a house that is not insulated, you can't really heat, so you have a huge gas bill. So every time the winter is harsher, you get all this talk about energy poverty, and then the government wants to give subsidies to the people who have high gas bills instead of giving them a subsidy to insulate their house. It's just the logic in the country. And at the bottom, we have things like infrastructure, so investment in infrastructure. As I said before, you need a reliable political framework within which you can place your investment. If you don't have that, you don't invest. You can see that with all the changes, like in Spain, the changes to the feed-in tariffs. They had a feed-in tariff very favorable, then they stopped it. Then all the investment, of course, was stranded or didn't happen anymore, and then it's difficult to... It's just not a financially or economically viable environment. Now, the special thing about hydrogen is you have a high number of different sources. So you can produce hydrogen from electricity with electrolysis. It's more or less the easiest you can do, but you can also take natural gas, you can reform it, so you strip the carbon from the hydrogen. You can also do the same thing with anything that is a hydrocarbon, so it doesn't have to be methane. Methane is the simplest, but it could also be crude oil, could be shale, could be whatever. You can use biomass or waste, so often enough residential waste is considered as a biomass. And you could also just have algae or bacteria turning sunlight into hydrogen, where essentially was the use of water, of course, but using sunlight as the primary source of energy. You can see the efficiencies. Steam reforming, natural gas is the highest, 85%. Electrolysis somewhere 65%, more modern 70%. Then goes down, so the least efficiency of bacteria or algae, which doesn't really hurt because you just have a big pond happily producing hydrogen. And then we also have photocatalytic hydrogen production, which is the least efficient and also has a long way to go. The message here is we have a large choice of sources. We're not just building on crude oil. Transport fuels, 85% import of just crude oil. And it's a very focused market. It's very dependent on very few countries which supply this crude oil. Similar, as was presented with natural gas, we're getting more and more dependent, especially because now in Europe we don't have the natural gas from Holland and from Scotland, or not as much anymore, and we're getting more and more dependent on imports. So hydrogen is one way of kind of broadening up. So this is the element of security. You have more choice. And a lot of these energy sources, like if you take renewable electricity, is indigenous. It's produced in the country. You don't have to import it. And if you don't have to import something, you don't have to shift your GDP outside of the country. You don't have to take the income you generate in the country and pay somebody outside of the country. So you're not shifting or shoveling your money outside of the country. So you're keeping it within, you're developing your own economy. So there's a number of advantages for using renewable energies. So adopting hydrogen increases energy diversity. You have different pathways of producing hydrogen. You have different sources you can use. In doing so, normally you invest into a process or into conversion equipment. You have no price volatility. So if you buy a photovoltaic array today, you pay now, and the price will never change. And you'll have electricity at a given price for 20 years. There's no price volatility at all. And something similar applies here. So the renewable electricity will be going down in price, but it won't be going up. And you have very secure investment conditions. So that's something banks will like. So once they buy into these ideas, as they did after a while for wind and photovoltaic projects, which you can always get financed with a bank today, after they learned it, so it took a couple of years, 10 years, similar things will happen here. Because the volatility, there's no risk. There's no risk of whatever interruption to oil supply because there's a war in Iraq. And of course also political dependency is reduced. And what happens is this. So now we have 3 distinct markets for natural gas, which is essentially heating. Some also electricity. We have the electricity, which is coal-fired nuclear gas, and we have oil, which goes into the transport markets. It's very separate, distinct markets, different fuels, and in future it could look like this. So we can shift from the electricity market into the transport market, into the heating market. We can shift from different sources into different applications. So heating can come from biomass. So biomass will be converted into gas, whether it's hydrogen or methane, doesn't matter. Can also work on synthetic natural gas. We don't have to work on hydrogen. We can use the same distribution grid, the same storage, whatever. It's completely compatible, but you see it's all interconnected. And once it's interconnected, you can shift from one market to the other. You can use price differences. Transport fuel is the most expensive, so there'd be a massive impetus from renewable electricity, which is getting dirt cheap, just producing transport fuels. And that's one thing hydrogen can deliver. You can't deliver this with oil or natural gas. Now, just to show you a little of our thinking in our group in Birmingham, so we've come up with this. So we want to use biomass as a source, so biomass waste, as I said, because it's carbon neutral. We can put that into anaerobic digestion and it produces biogas, which is mostly 65–70% methane, the rest is carbon dioxide. You could clean that up if you wanted and feed that into the natural gas grid as pure methane. So essentially you're even improving the quality of the gas. The part you can't digest because it's not proteins and fats, because it's cellulosis, for instance, you'd have to gasify. So you produce a syngas, which is a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. So this syngas you can methanate and then also feed into the natural gas grid. So essentially you're turning biomass as a carbon neutral source and a solid source, which you can also store and all these things, turning it into a gas which is easily transported, fits into the natural gas grid we have already, all the infrastructure most of Europe has. Now this natural gas we can use in SOC, so the fuel cells N is also producing. Very high efficiency because part of the heat that is produced in the process we can recycle to upgrade the fuel quality. So essentially we use it for reforming, internal reforming, and we produce electricity and heat at efficiencies somewhere between 60 and 70% delivered to the grid. So unbeatable by any other device. We can also use the biogas directly in the SOC, what we call dry reforming, no water, we just pass it through. The CO2 is used for reforming the methane, and we can do the same with the syngas. So this type of fuel cell, this high temperature fuel cell, can use all these different gases, can use carbon monoxide, hydrogen, methane, ethanol, even carbon direct. You could even run it on carbon. So it's incredibly versatile, which again gives us more energy security in the sense that if one fuel is not available, we switch to another one. And in theory, not always in practice, because there's some technical susceptibilities here, you could switch an SOC from methane to hydrogen and back again. It would work. It doesn't really mind. There's some issues about heat removal, but whatever. Now, I can also use renewable electricity and through an electrolyzer. And if I don't only feed water, but I feed water and carbon dioxide, I produce the same syngas. So essentially, I have the same product in the middle at the top, whether I use biomass gasification or co-electrolysis. And from there, I go through methanation or whatever. And then I can also, we found in the last years that this SOC, we can just turn around. We can use it as an electrolyzer. So the same device will either turn hydrogen into electricity and heat, or with some heat added, turn water back into hydrogen. It's the same device. And we're just working on doing that with co-electrolysis. So essentially, on the right side, we're using electricity, renewable electricity. On the left side, we're using solid renewable fuels, and we end up in the same system, which is the natural gas grid. Completely compatible with what we have today, and we can just feed in. We don't have the problems with feeding in hydrogen with different heating values, whatever, not being able to account for the energy we've supplied. It's 100% compatible. We lose a bit of efficiency in all these processes, but I don't really care because it's renewable input. So you just have to build a little larger. And in the end, you have a zero carbon system, or effectively zero carbon. You would be releasing the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So you're using the atmosphere as a storage. You release water and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and take it back again. And then you find in future you wouldn't do that. You would be recycling the CO2. You'd have a closed loop for CO2. You'd have an infrastructure for CO2. You wouldn't release it to the atmosphere anymore. And the biomass would be perpetually capturing it. So essentially you have a much better system than you'd ever get with any carbon capture and sequestration. So the solid oxide fuel cell is essential in this because it has the flexibility of the fuels, it has the very high efficiency, and it can be reversed. You can't do that with a low temperature fuel cell. Theoretically you can, but not technically. And in this case you can technically do that. And you're not even getting disadvantages, you're getting advantages. So the aging, the degradation of the fuel cell will get better if you reverse it, which is quite surprising. So, what else? There's a number of other things you can do with a fuel cell you can't do otherwise. That's why we call it enabling technology. Like the Toyota Mirai has a socket, and you can actually plug your house into the vehicle. You can't do that in Europe because the standard is different, but in Japan you can do that. Or you could, I mean, not exactly a Mirai, but imagine you'd have a similar vehicle, you're a craftsman, you go to a building site, you don't have an energy supply, you just plug your tools into your vehicle. And you have a supply of energy of 220 volts AC energy on your building site, which you otherwise have to pay a lot of money for. So there's a large number of things you can do with this energy supply unit, whether it's a car, or so packaged as a car or whatever, or something you carry around, which you can't do with other things. Or you'd have a noisy Honda 3-5 kilowatt engine running, which breaks down all the time because it's not built for continuous operation. So it gives you the possibility to do things. So you could also build a backup from the vehicle. I'll get into that in a moment. You have this linking of the electricity grid and the gas grid, so you have all these possibilities of shifting around. And with a fuel cell, whatever size you build it, you could also supply portable power. So you could actually go on a sailing trip for 2 weeks. You take 5-10 liters of methanol along, and you have a fuel cell supplying your laptop and whatever with electricity all the time. And otherwise, you'd have to have an engine running, you'd have to take along petrol, all the smell, all the stuff. And with a fuel cell, you can get this much cheaper, much lighter, and with no noise and no disturbance, no emissions. So this again about the reversibility. So if you look at and that was the initial thing. So Schönbein and Grove, essentially, they start with electrolysis was the first thing. So once Volta had invented the battery, you had a source of voltage. Someone stuck the two 2 electrodes into a pot of water, something, you saw water, you saw something bubbling, then that's how hydrogen was identified and oxygen were identified as gases. And Schoenbeis somehow got this idea this should be reversible, and then they actually managed to build this as a reversible cell. So it's been known for ages, but we've only started, I think, 10 years ago of actually doing this technically. And you can do it with a low temperature fuel cell, as I said, but it doesn't really last very long, and a high temperature fuel cell you can actually run for, what have they done, 3 years, I think now. So that's quite unique, and it's essentially also unique for the high temperature fuel cells. Just as an aside, so you could turn 100% of the electricity you put into a high temperature electrolysis into 100% hydrogen. The lie behind that is you have to supply heat, so you're not accounting for the heat. So you just say, oh, I have some sort of high temperature heat source. Okay, could be a solar receiver. Essentially, you could have a solar trough, you just need steam, essentially. 200 degrees centigrade steam, and then you can take off, and you can actually turn all of the electricity into hydrogen. So very close to 100%. If you then have a 70% efficiency electricity production, you'd have a round-trip efficiency of 70%, which gets close to a hydro scheme already. And you can't do that with anything else. Now, the other element, that's distributed systems. A fuel cell, if you think of micro CHP, will be a distributed system. So you'll have a small fuel cell system sitting in all kinds of houses. What we have today is a centralized system. We have the large power plants, which mostly sit where the fuel is. So today, coal-fired power plants sit on the coast because all the coal comes from Australia. They used to sit where the coal mines are. So that's shifted now. We see them on the coast. Which, by the way, gives us the same problems as wind energy. So everybody in Germany complains. Wind energy sits on the coast. We have no grid there because nobody ever bothered to build it. Now the coal-fired power station sits on the coast, and they have to build the grid, and nobody's complaining about that, but they complain about the wind grid. Anyway, so we have top-down production, very large units, 1 gigawatt, because you need that for the efficiency. If you don't have a gigawatt or 500 megawatt coal-fired power plant, you just don't have the high efficiency. And then it's fed down to the consumers. You can see at the bottom, so the high and middle voltage grid to the left, then transformers, low voltage grid. High losses on the low voltage grid, anywhere between 3, 5, 7%. Very low losses on the high voltage grid. So that's the structure we have today. What also happens, the longer the line on the low voltage side, the more voltage drop we have. Now, once photovoltaic comes in, photovoltaic will also always be distributed, so you have photovoltaic panels on the houses. What then happens is you have the feed-in from the right to the left. So the first thing that happens is you lift the voltage. So you're avoiding all these losses you have on the line, which is all ohmic losses, all heat. And that you lift up again. So you make the whole distribution system much more efficient with photovoltaics, because you're using it much more sensibly. But the other thing is this. Today, we're turning from this top-down into something much more mixed, and it might even be bottom-up later. So this prosumer, producer and consumer at the same time. So this would be the conventional, and now we're feeding back. So either it's wind energy, which is also centralized, so you're feeding back at a higher level, but we're also feeding back from photovoltaics at a lower level, as I said just now, so you're bumping up the distribution grids. And then we also have fuel cells in houses, micro CHP, and you can see here the direction turns round. We're feeding up into the grid from the lower grid. This also gives us the possibility to integrate storage. So lots of people, it's not quite sensible economically, but lots of people want their photovoltaic system with a storage, with a 5, 10 kilowatt hour battery. Costs a fortune at the moment, will be cheaper later, but this means we have distributed storage all over the place. So every house has storage for 1 day of electricity, like 10 kilowatt hours. So it has 20 kilowatt hours, would last them two to 3 days. So inherently in the system, we have storage, so the network wouldn't even have to pay. And what's more, we have lots of inverters. So with photovoltaics and with fuel cells, we have to convert direct current to alternating current. So this inverter will have to know what 50 hertz is. So this inverter is getting a 50 hertz signal from the grid to synchronize with the grid. Then you might know about active reactive power. because we can shift the phase in these inverters freely, because it's electronics, we can also do grid services. So the whole grid becomes much more stable, because there's no question about phase shift or whatever. It can also all be done locally, and there's storage all over the place. So essentially, this decentralized or distributed energy system is much more stable than it is before. It gets more complicated, so it's more complex, and it's more difficult to coordinate or manage, but inherently it's much more stable. So we have less transmission losses. We can avoid building new lines because we're using the lines much more efficiently. We have higher reliability. I'll come back to that in a moment. You could have self-sufficiency, for instance, by having lots of photovoltaics and storage, but it gets much more complex. Could also get more expensive. And if you had lots of, say, combustion engine micro CHP, it will also get less efficient. With fuel cells, it gets more efficient, but you wouldn't be able to do this with lots of engines. So now what about the reliability? This is what we have now, and if we have any incident on the grid, off goes the lights. So you have a whole area, so we were discussing yesterday, if you blow up the power station here and you blow up the line to Russia, I think, there's no electricity in Estonia. And if this was a distributed system, what you could do is you could just disconnect your house from the grid, switch on your fuel cell, and off you go. The only prerequisite is that you still have gas, which normally is the case. So, of course, some of the gas grid will run on electricity. You need some sort of compressors, whatever. If those have a backup generator, you're fine. If you had a major earthquake, you might also have damaged the gas lines, but I don't think we have this here. But gas lines are easier to repair than electricity lines. And then you just switch on the light again. The prerequisite is as I said before, the inverter needs to know what 50 hertz is. So you need a 50 hertz signal, but then you put in a quartz clock, and once the grid comes back, you have to synchronize, and off you go. It's all electronic. You could also disconnect a whole branch or parts of a branch. So in case of, say, there was a storm, Irma or whatever, has taken out your electricity grid, you can build up the system again, at least to a certain level. So every hospital here, every, say, government building, school, whatever, would be back online. And you can't do that with a centralized system. It's just not possible. And essentially that's what all these companies who buy the Bloom systems are doing already. So Google, whatever, they don't want to go out of business when the California grid fails again. And they're all doing what you see at the bottom there. So then it doesn't have to be a natural disaster, it could also be a cyber attack. So if I was somebody sitting in, I don't know where, won't name anybody, I had a nuclear power station sitting somewhere and I just want to play with it. Here's a gigawatt I can take out. It would just take me maybe a month to get through all the security. That's a clear-cut goal. Now, the same gigawatt I could have with 1 million 1 kilowatt residential systems. Now, I can't imagine anybody wanting to take out 1 million systems. I mean, the time that will take. It's not a target. I mean, what's the point of taking out 1 kilowatt for one building? You want to take out the whole grid. And second, it's just a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of number crunching. We have had these, so the probability this will happen is much lower. I mean, who cares about the heating in your building? You want to take out the national electricity grid. You wouldn't even be able to see that, whether you've been successful. Of course, then comes the discussion that maybe the single houses aren't protected as well, and they all have the same shitty Windows 7 or 10 or whatever, and all the back doors everybody knows about, and have common software, of course. And that gets an issue if you have this Internet of Things. It will get an issue anyway. So there has to be some level of protection there. But I'm still pretty sure that for somebody sitting, I don't know where, taking out a residential heating system will not have the attractivity of taking out a nuclear power station. And you won't put the effort into that. So essentially, this small-scale distributed system is just safer. And you can't blow up 1 million residential heating systems. I mean, what's the point of that? You can blow up a nuclear power station or have a plane crash on it or whatever. So malignant interference, as I call it, or terrorist attack is just much less probable. And there's much less you can achieve because you can rebuild lots of the electricity system, as I showed just now. So fuel cells, because they can be built at all these different sizes, just support grid functions, so reduce the distribution losses, reliability is much higher, you can black start with a couple of prerequisites, and you have the increased fuel flexibility. So essentially, if the gas grid fails, you could also, within relatively short time, get a propane gas tank or something, and then continue. Or propane bottle, and would last you a day or two. So, now a few words about policy. As it sits today, we're much too focused on these fossil resources. So as I mentioned before, there's 500 billion of subsidies to oil companies, coal companies worldwide every year, which essentially is tax credits. So say the US government says securing the oil supply is a national interest, and anybody prospecting for oil doesn't have to pay taxes. And the total of that amounts to 500 billion per year. And nobody takes that stance for, say, renewable energy, saying building the grid, having the windmills and the photovoltaics in plant is a national interest. Now we go for that, and we spend not even 500 billion for that, and you'd be there. So governments are far too focused on the large companies just because they have the economic power and the lobbying system, and far too little focus on making the whole energy system resilient in the sense of what I presented here. And then, of course, you always have this problem. It's 4 to 5 years of government period, and don't want to bash politicians, but often enough you find this thinking just for the parliamentary period. On the low-carbon energy systems or zero-carbon, you might have to think much longer. It's sort of this strategic, as I said, so if Euro 7 or 8 is promised and it will come, you'll get a very long-term perspective for investment. If it's somehow put into question, nobody will invest because nobody knows what will be happening. And a lot of these things are long-term because you invest now and you get the benefits later. And a lot of people are used to looking at investments like how much will the car be, so I go for the cheapest car or the flashiest I can get for least money, but I don't look at the operating cost. Most of Europe does do these things if you look at houses, so we have these energy certificates so that you can actually look up what will your gas bill be. It's a problem in the UK that they don't properly look at that. And so policies just have to give you a framework, and they have to give you a long-term framework, not just for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So the EU is quite good at this, so these 2020 targets and 2030 have been around for a while, and they actually give you this perspective. They give an investment, positive investment environment. And the other thing is, if you want to embrace the things I showed at the beginning, you need a much more encompassing view of the energy system. You're not just looking at oil imports and you're looking at the natural gas supply and electricity grid, you're looking at a much more complex system. And essentially, you need somebody who will take care of this. Not actually a regulatory body, but somebody who says, okay, we have too much wind energy coming up. Is there somebody who wants to use this? So essentially, it's like a brokerage. You need an extended brokerage, energy brokerage platform, which says, okay, we have surplus here. Is there anybody else in the transport sector who wants this energy? Then I was talking about the cost already. So we need the incentives where the government says, look, we are paying for this out of the taxpayers' income. Could the actual, the people who caused this impact, could they please pay up in whatever way that's done? And then, of course, I mean, bottom line, we're always happy to get more funding. The reality behind this being that in the last years, we've seen this sort of hype for batteries. So a lot of people in my old group sort of moved away. They crawled away towards batteries because that's where all the money was. And now that's drying up, and now they're looking for the next thing. So what you want is like a long-term perspective. There will be funding in this area, and you can build a university group or a research group which will be working across several decades and actually being experts in the area. So in the UK, I think we're the largest group just because everybody else is now doing batteries. And then they will be doing, I don't know, nanomaterials or something. But they never stick to their guns and be good at what they're actually doing. So, just wrapping up, I think. What can hydrogen fuel cells do? So they can increase the independence of Europe from fossil fuels by producing the energy we need ourselves, so always building on increased efficiency. Increase the stability of the economy because we don't have to import our energy. We can keep the money in the EU and foster the EU economy with that money instead of fostering Saudi Arabia, whoever. And we can create an energy system which is much more resilient, much more robust, so which will not be impacted so much by natural disasters. And we can, I mean, with climate change, we will be seeing more severe storms and more frequent storms and harsher weather. So, and if the infrastructure is more resilient, not just because it's built in a different way, but also because it's more distributed, that will be a tremendous benefit. And again, that study is also on the internet, as are the other three I showed right at the beginning. And these are the co-authors on this study. Good, thanks, and I think we'll take the questions at the end. Thank you.